A poor single mother working as a maid for a billionaire CEO is forced to take her baby to work. When she gets there, the child runs towards the man and hugs him. What he says next leaves everyone in shock. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The sun had barely risen over the sleepy town when Clara Hastings juggled her way out of their tiny apartment, one hand clutching Jamie's bag and the other balancing a coffee thermos that had already spilled twice. Jamie, her 3-year-old son, bounded ahead of her in his bright red superhero cape, arms outstretched as if he were about to take flight. "Jamie, slow down!" Clara called after him, panting as she locked the door. "We're already late." "But superheroes don't need to hurry, Mommy. We're always on time," Jamie declared, striking a dramatic pose in the hallway. Clara smiled despite the stress pressing on her. Jamie's boundless optimism had a way of brightening her darkest days, but this morning, she couldn't shake the knot in her stomach. Her babysitter, Mrs. Hernandez, had called last minute to cancel, and Clara couldn't risk missing another shift. Veronica Blackwell, her glamorous but icy employer, had already reminded her twice last week that punctuality reflects character. Bringing Jamie to the mansion wasn't an ideal solution, but Clara was out of options. As she wrestled Jamie into his tiny sneakers, he beamed up at her with that contagious grin of his. "Don't worry, Mommy. I'll save the day," he announced, adjusting the cape around his shoulders. "Save the day by staying out of trouble, okay?" Clara pleaded, ruffling his curly brown hair. Jamie nodded solemnly, but the mischievous twinkle in his eyes betrayed him. The drive to the Blackwell estate was mercifully short, though Clara's nerves only grew with each passing minute. Victor Blackwell was a name that carried weight in every business column and social circle. Reclusive and intimidating, he was a man of few words but impossible to ignore. His wife, Veronica, was his polar opposite, vivacious, fashion-forward, and sharp-tongued. Clara often felt invisible in their enormous mansion, a silent observer of their picture-perfect life that felt like it belonged in a glossy magazine. Bringing Jamie into that world felt like carrying a ticking time bomb. "Is this the castle, Mommy?" Jamie asked as they pulled up to the iron gates. His eyes widened as the sprawling Blackwell mansion came into view, with its marble columns and manicured gardens. "Kind of," Clara replied, distractedly punching the gate code into the keypad. "But no running, no yelling, and definitely no touching anything. Got it?" Jamie nodded, but the sight of the fountain in the driveway sent him squirming with excitement. "Does the castle have dragons?" he whispered, clutching Clara's hand as they walked up the steps. "Only grumpy ones," Clara muttered under her breath, imagining Veronica's reaction when she saw Jamie. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing Charles, the Blackwells' ever-stoic butler. He raised an eyebrow at the sight of Jamie, but Clara quickly explained the situation, stammering out apologies. Charles's expression softened, if only slightly, as he stepped aside to let them in. "Just keep him out of Mrs. Blackwell's way," he warned. "Trust me, I'll try," Clara replied, gripping Jamie's hand tighter as they entered the grand foyer. Jamie gasped audibly, his gaze darting from the chandelier to the marble staircase to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. Clara could almost see the wheels turning in his head as he plotted his next adventure. "Jamie, remember what I said," she whispered, crouching down to his level. "Stay close to me, okay? I'm a superhero, Mommy," he whispered back. "I have to protect the castle." Clara groaned but managed a small laugh, standing to her full height as she led him toward the kitchen. Her job for the morning involved polishing the silverware and dusting the dining room, tasks that would ordinarily take her about an hour if she worked quickly. With Jamie in tow, she wasn't so sure. As she worked, Jamie busied himself by drawing pictures at the kitchen island. Clara glanced over occasionally to make sure he wasn't up to anything, and for the most part, he seemed content. But then, just as she began dusting the dining room shelves, she heard the unmistakable sound of little feet pattering across the marble floor. "Jamie?" Clara called, setting down her duster and hurrying into the hallway. He was gone. Her heart leapt into her throat as she scanned the room, darting past the grand staircase and into the living room. Panic bubbled inside her as she imagined him breaking something priceless, or worse, crossing paths with Veronica. "Jamie!" she called again, her voice louder this time. "Mommy, I found the king!" Jamie's voice echoed from the direction of the study. Clara froze. "The what?" She hurried toward the study, her footsteps quickening as she rounded the corner. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was Jamie, his little arms wrapped tightly around Victor Blackwell's legs. "Daddy!" Jamie exclaimed, grinning up at the startled billionaire. Victor, who had been reading a financial report, looked down at Jamie with an expression that teetered between confusion and amusement. His sharp suit and perfectly combed hair seemed almost comically out of place next to Jamie's red cape and mismatched socks. Clara's cheeks burned as she rushed forward, scooping Jamie into her arms. "I am so sorry, Mr. Blackwell," she stammered, her words tumbling over each other. He's got such an active imagination, and I..." Victor held up a hand, silencing her. His piercing blue eyes shifted from Clara to Jamie, who was now grinning from ear to ear. "Jamie, is it?" Victor asked, his voice calm but firm. Jamie nodded. "You look like me," he said matter-of-factly. "Mommy says I don't have a daddy, but maybe you're him?" Clara wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Jamie!" she hissed, clutching him tighter. "That's enough." But before she could say more, Veronica appeared in the doorway, her designer heels clicking against the floor. She froze, her perfectly manicured nails clutching her phone, as her gaze fell on Jamie. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cold enough to freeze the room. Clara's heart sank as she turned to face Veronica. "Mrs. Blackwell, I can explain." But before she could finish, Jamie pointed at Veronica and whispered loudly, "Is she the dragon?" Victor coughed, poorly disguising a laugh, while Veronica's eyes narrowed dangerously. Clara, mortified beyond belief, forced a strained smile. He means no harm. He's just very imaginative." Veronica said nothing, her icy gaze fixed on Clara as if she were dirt under her designer heels. I'll get back to work," Clara muttered, carrying Jamie out of the room as quickly as possible. As they disappeared down the hall, Victor glanced at the door, still amused. For the first time in years someone, had disrupted the perfect monotony of his life. And though he didn't know it yet, the little boy in the red cape would change everything. Clara could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she carried Jamie back to the kitchen. Her cheeks were still flushed from embarrassment, and she barely noticed the weight of Jamie's tiny arms wrapped around her neck. "Jamie, what were you thinking?" she whispered, her voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You can't just run up to people like that, especially not Mr. Blackwell." Jamie leaned back slightly in her arms, his face as innocent as ever. "But Mommy, he does look like me." And he wasn't mad. He smiled. Clara set him down on a stool at the kitchen island, running a hand through her hair as she tried to compose herself. She knew she couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent overdue and groceries running low. "Just promise me you'll stay right here, okay? No more running off." Jamie nodded, swinging his legs back and forth, already distracted by the cape tied around his shoulders. "Okay, Mommy. But can I have some cookies?" "Jamie," Clara sighed. "I'll see if they have any later. Just behave." Satisfied for the moment, she turned her attention back to the task at hand. The dining room still needed dusting, and she didn't want to give Veronica or Victor another reason to look her way. She grabbed the duster and forced herself to focus, keeping one ear tuned for the sound of tiny footsteps. As she worked, she replayed the earlier scene in her head, the way Jamie had wrapped himself around Victor's legs so easily, so naturally. It had rattled her more than she cared to admit. Jamie was a curious and imaginative little boy, but there was something about his reaction to Victor that struck a chord in her, something she didn't want to think too deeply about. She was still lost in thought when she heard Jamie's voice again, echoing through the hall. "Daddy!" Clara froze, the duster slipping from her hand. Her heart sank as she spun around, realizing Jamie was no longer in the kitchen. "Jamie!" she called, rushing out of the dining room. Her footsteps echoed loudly against the marble floors as she scanned the grand hall, her chest tightening with panic. And then she saw him. Jamie was halfway across the hall, running full speed toward Victor, who had just stepped out of his study. Clara's stomach dropped as Jamie threw his arms around Victor's legs, grinning up at him with the purest joy. "Daddy!" Jamie said again, his voice ringing out like a bell. Victor froze, his usual composure slipping into something that resembled shock. He glanced down at Jamie, then up at Clara, who was running toward them with a look of sheer mortification. "Jamie!" Clara gasped, scooping him up into her arms. Her face burned as she turned to Victor, words tumbling out of her mouth in a panicked rush. "I am so sorry, Mr. Blackwell. He doesn't mean, he has such an imagination, and I..." Victor held up a hand, silencing her. His expression was unreadable as he looked at Jamie, who was now leaning against Clara's shoulder, completely unfazed. "Why did you call me that?" Victor asked, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Jamie tilted his head, as if the answer was obvious. "Because you look like me. And you're tall, like my action figure." Victor blinked, caught off guard by the comparison. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the sound of shattering porcelain broke the moment. Veronica stood in the doorway to the sitting room, her teacup in pieces on the floor. Her wide, startled eyes darted from Victor to Jamie to Clara, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. "What?" Veronica said slowly, her voice cold and sharp. "Is going on here?" Clara felt her stomach churn as she turned to face Veronica. "Mrs. Blackwell, I can explain." But Veronica wasn't looking at her. Her piercing gaze was fixed on Victor, who seemed just as stunned as everyone else. "Who is this child?" Veronica demanded, stepping closer. Her voice was icy, her movements deliberate, as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't yet make sense. Victor cleared his throat, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. "Veronica, this is Clara's son," he said carefully, as though each word were a fragile glass ornament. "He seems to have mistaken me for someone else." "Yeah, his daddy," Jamie chimed in, beaming up at Victor. "And he's really tall, just like my superhero." Victor let out a short, incredulous laugh, clearly caught off guard by Jamie's persistence. Even Veronica seemed momentarily stunned by the child's bluntness. "Jamie!" Clara hissed, her voice low and desperate. "That's enough." "But it's true," Jamie protested, frowning. "You always said my daddy was a hero. Maybe it's him." Clara wanted to disappear. She tightened her grip on Jamie, her face flaming with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's just imaginative." Victor studied Jamie for a long moment, his expression softening despite himself. There was something about the boy's earnestness, his unfiltered honesty, that struck a chord. But before he could respond, Veronica's sharp voice cut through the air. "This is completely inappropriate," she snapped, glaring at Clara. "Why is your child even here? Do you think this is some kind of playground?" Clara flinched, her grip on Jamie tightening. "I didn't have a choice, Mrs. Blackwell," she said quietly, forcing herself to meet Veronica's gaze. "My babysitter canceled last minute, and I couldn't miss work." Veronica's lips curled into a sneer. "Well, maybe you should prioritize finding reliable childcare instead of parading your son around here and causing confusion." Clara's chest tightened, but before she could respond, Jamie leaned toward Victor, his voice breaking the tension. "Do you have a cape?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "All superheroes need capes." Victor blinked, caught off guard by the sudden question. He glanced at Clara, who looked mortified, before turning back to Jamie. "I don't have a cape," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But I suppose I'll have to get one now." Jamie grinned, clearly pleased with the answer. I can give you mine, he offered, tugging at the knot around his neck. Clara's heart ached as she watched the exchange, her emotions a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and something she couldn't quite name. She cleared her throat, shifting Jamie in her arms. I'll just get back to work, she said quietly, avoiding Veronica's glare. Victor nodded, his expression unreadable once more. That might be best. As Clara turned to leave, Jamie waved enthusiastically over her shoulder. Bye, Daddy! Clara winced, quickening her pace as Veronica's heels clicked sharply behind them. But as she carried Jamie back to the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment had shifted something, like the first crack in a long frozen lake. And deep down, she knew it wouldn't be the last. Clara spent the rest of the afternoon trying to keep her head down, but her heart refused to settle. Every time she replayed the scene in her mind, Jamie calling Victor Daddy, the stunned look on Victor's face, and the icy venom in Veronica's tone, she felt her stomach twist. She could only hope that the day would end without further incident. Jamie, thankfully, seemed oblivious to the tension. He had perched himself on a stool in the kitchen, happily coloring a superhero scene with a set of crayons Charles had begrudgingly provided. Clara kept glancing at him, her heart tightening every time she saw his carefree smile. He had no idea what kind of storm he might have accidentally stirred. As she moved to the pantry to retrieve cleaning supplies, the sound of sharp heels clicking against the tile floor made her freeze. She turned slowly, dreading what she knew was coming. Veronica stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression as sharp as the cut of her designer dress. Clara, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. A word. Clara swallowed hard and nodded. Of course, Mrs. Blackwell. Veronica's gaze flicked to Jamie, who was now humming softly to himself as he filled in a bright red cape on his drawing. Clara quickly stepped in front of him, her protective instincts flaring, but Veronica didn't move closer. Instead, she gestured for Clara to follow her out of the kitchen. Once they were in the hallway, Veronica turned to face her, her cold blue eyes narrowing. I want to know what exactly is going on here, she said, her voice low but sharp. Your son seems very familiar with my husband. Clara's stomach dropped. Mrs. Blackwell, I assure you, Jamie didn't mean anything by it. He's just a child with a big imagination. I'm not talking about his imagination, Veronica interrupted, her tone slicing through Clara's words. I'm talking about his resemblance to Victor. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you haven't noticed. Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't think of a single thing to say. She wanted to deny it, to brush off Veronica's accusation, but the truth was staring her in the face. Jamie did look like Victor, more than she had ever wanted to admit. I don't know what you're implying, Clara said finally, forcing her voice to remain steady. Jamie's father is not in the picture. Veronica's eyes narrowed further. And who is Jamie's father, exactly? Clara hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't tell Veronica the truth, not all of it, at least. It was too complicated, too messy, and she wasn't even sure she had the whole truth herself. But her silence only seemed to fuel Veronica's suspicion. I see, Veronica said, her lips curving into a bitter smile. Convenient, isn't it? No father in the picture, and yet here you are, working in my home, with a child who looks like my husband. That's not fair, Clara said, her voice trembling. I've never fair? Veronica cut her off with a sharp laugh. Life isn't fair, Clara. And if I find out that you've been scheming, I haven't, Clara said, her voice rising in desperation. Jamie and we don't want anything from you or Mr. Blackwell. I just need this job. Veronica studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone in the hallway, her heart pounding. Back in the kitchen, Jamie looked up from his drawing as Clara returned, his smile fading when he saw the look on her face. Mommy, are you okay? Clara forced herself to smile, crouching down beside him. I'm fine, sweetheart, she said softly, brushing a hand through his curls. But you need to stay here, okay? No more exploring. Jamie nodded solemnly. Okay, Mommy. I promise. As he returned to his drawing, Clara sat down at the table, her mind racing. Veronica's words had shaken her, but what scared her even more was the realization that she couldn't completely deny what Veronica was implying. The resemblance between Jamie and Victor was undeniable, his bright blue eyes, the shape of his jaw, even the way his smile lit up his face. Her thoughts drifted back to a time she had tried so hard to forget. 4 years ago, she'd been a waitress at a small restaurant, working long shifts to make ends meet. One night, a man had walked in, handsome, confident, with an air of mystery that had immediately drawn her in. They had talked for hours, his charm and intelligence making her feel like the only person in the world. It had been a whirlwind romance, brief but intense. He never told her much about himself, always deflecting questions about his job or his life outside their time together. She hadn't pressed him, swept up in the magic of it all. But then, one day, he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, just a memory that lingered in the corners of her mind. When she found out she was pregnant, she tried to track him down, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. She never even knew his real name, only the way he made her feel like she mattered, if only for a moment. And now, as she sat in the Blackwell mansion, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling that the man from her past and Victor Blackwell were one and the same. Clara shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. It didn't matter now. Even if Victor was Jamie's father, what could she do about it? He was a billionaire with a wife and a life so far removed from hers that it might as well have been a different planet. And she didn't want to turn Jamie's life into a spectacle, a battleground for people like Veronica to tear apart. She glanced at Jamie, who was now humming softly to himself as he drew a bright yellow sun in the corner of his paper. He was happy, carefree, everything she had worked so hard to give him, despite their struggles. She wouldn't let anything jeopardize that. But as much as she tried to push the thought away, it lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. And Clara had a feeling that her quiet, carefully constructed life was about to unravel. Clara barely slept that night, her mind racing with all the ways things could go wrong. Veronica's accusations haunted her, and she couldn't shake the fear that she might lose her job. The next morning, as she hurried Jamie out the door and into the car, she gave herself a silent pep talk. Just get through the day. Be invisible. Keep Jamie out of trouble. But Jamie had other plans. As they pulled up to the Blackwell mansion, Jamie was already fidgeting with excitement. Mommy, do you think the big man will be here again? The one with the cool suit? Clara's stomach flipped, and she forced a smile. Mr. Blackwell is busy with work, Jamie. He's not here to play. Jamie pouted for a moment but perked up again as they walked inside. Charles, the butler, greeted them with his usual formality, giving Jamie a wary glance. I trust today will be uneventful? Clara sighed. I'll do my best. Jamie, however, was already tugging at his superhero cape, whispering, Time to save the day. While Clara busied herself with her tasks, Jamie found ways to make himself helpful. Within an hour, he'd attempted to polish the grand piano with whipped cream he'd stolen from the kitchen. Because shiny things like dessert. Clara caught him just in time and spent the next 10 minutes apologizing profusely to the staff as they wiped the sticky mess off the ivory keys. Moments later, Jamie reappeared in the dining room, holding a tin of caviar he'd somehow procured from the pantry. Mommy, do you think the dog likes this? He asked innocently, holding the tin out to the confused golden retriever lounging by the fireplace. Jamie! Clara yelped, snatching the caviar from his hands. Where did you even? Never mind. Just sit down and draw something. Please. Jamie reluctantly obeyed, but not before giving the dog a conspiratorial wink. Clara collapsed into a chair for a moment, pressing her palms against her temples. If she could just keep him contained for a few more hours, maybe, just maybe, they'd make it through the day without another disaster. Meanwhile, in his private study, Victor Blackwell was piecing together a plan of his own. The events of the previous day had left him shaken, and not much managed to shake Victor. He was a man who thrived on logic and precision, but now he found himself staring at the puzzle Jamie had unintentionally laid before him. The boy's face was etched in his mind, his bright blue eyes, his easy smile, the way he'd confidently called him, Daddy, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And then there was Clara, with her nervous demeanor and her reluctance to answer questions about Jamie's father. Something wasn't adding up. Victor reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the juice cup Jamie had left behind in the study the day before. He stared at it for a moment, then picked up the phone. "Dr. Patel," he said when the call connected. "I need a discrete DNA test done. Today." The doctor hesitated on the other end of the line. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. May I ask, no questions?" Victor interrupted. "I'll send over the sample." As he hung up, Victor leaned back in his chair, his mind churning. If there was even a chance that Jamie was his son. No, he wouldn't jump to conclusions. He'd wait for the results. But the thought refused to leave him alone, gnawing at the edges of his carefully ordered world. Downstairs, Veronica was pacing the sitting room, her fury barely contained. She'd spent the night replaying Clara's hesitant answers, and the resemblance between Jamie and Victor was too glaring to ignore. When Victor had brushed off her concerns, it only fueled her paranoia. "Infidelity," she muttered under her breath, her voice sharp with bitterness. "It's the only explanation." When she spotted Clara walking by with a basket of laundry, Veronica called her name, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. Clara stopped, her grip tightening on the basket. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwell?" Veronica tilted her head, a sly smile playing on her lips. "I've been thinking about our little conversation yesterday, and I couldn't help but notice how evasive you were." Clara swallowed hard. "I wasn't trying to be evasive. There's nothing to tell." "Oh, Clara," Veronica said with a cold laugh. "There's always something to tell. And trust me, I'll find out what it is." Clara felt a chill run down her spine as Veronica sauntered away, leaving her standing frozen in the hallway. She clutched the basket tighter, her mind racing. It wasn't just her job at stake anymore. Veronica's veiled threats made it clear that she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth, whatever it took. Back in the kitchen, Jamie had somehow managed to charm one of the chefs into letting him help frost a cake. Clara returned just in time to see him standing on a stool, his hands and face covered in chocolate. "Jamie!" she exclaimed, rushing over to pull him down. "You're supposed to be sitting still." "But Mommy, I'm saving the cake," he said, holding up a frosting-covered spoon like a sword. Clara couldn't help but laugh, despite the chaos. She wiped his face clean, her heart aching with a mix of love and frustration. Jamie was her world, her reason for everything. She would protect him no matter what, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their world was on the brink of change. Later that evening, Victor received a call from Dr. Patel. He listened intently as the doctor confirmed what he'd both feared and suspected: Jamie was his son. Victor's hand tightened around the phone, his mind reeling. He'd built his life on control, on order, on knowing every detail about the world around him. But this was something he hadn't anticipated. "Thank you, doctor," he said quietly, ending the call. He sat in his study for a long time, staring out the window at the sprawling gardens below. Jamie's laughter echoed faintly through the house, and Victor felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of guilt, wonder, and a growing sense of responsibility. His son. The words felt foreign and yet undeniably right. But what did it mean for Clara? For Veronica? For all of them? Victor leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. For the first time in years, he didn't have all the answers. But one thing was certain: his life would never be the same again. Victor spent the rest of the evening pacing his study, the weight of the DNA results pressing down on him. Jamie was his son. The evidence was undeniable, yet it didn't feel real. How had he gone 4 years without knowing? How could he have been so blind? His thoughts were a whirlwind of guilt, surprise, and confusion. When he finally left the study, the mansion was quiet. Veronica had gone to bed hours ago, but Victor couldn't sleep. He found himself wandering the halls, drawn to the faint sound of Clara's voice coming from the kitchen. She was talking softly to Jamie, her tone soothing as she coaxed him into finishing his dinner. Victor lingered in the shadows, watching the tender moment between mother and son. Jamie was animated, waving his arms as he told Clara about his heroic day of frosting cakes and saving the piano. Clara laughed, the sound light and genuine, and for a moment, Victor felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't his. But it was his world, wasn't it? Jamie was his son. The thought hit him again, a mixture of pride and guilt twisting in his chest. He couldn't avoid this any longer. It was time for answers. The next morning, Clara was polishing the dining room table when Victor appeared in the doorway. His presence filled the room, and Clara straightened immediately, clutching her cleaning cloth like a lifeline. "Mr. Blackwell," she said nervously. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes," Victor said, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk. Privately." Clara's heart sank, but she nodded, following him into the study. The heavy wooden door closed behind them, and Clara stood awkwardly by the desk, her nerves fraying with each passing second. Victor turned to face her, his piercing blue eyes locked on hers. "Clara," he began, his tone measured, "I need you to be honest with me. Who is Jamie's father?" Clara's breath caught, her mind racing. She'd known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to answer. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Clara, I had a DNA test done. Jamie is my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Clara's knees nearly gave out, and she gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. You did a DNA test?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I had to know the truth," Victor said, his voice softer now. "And now I need to hear it from you. Did you know? Did you know who I was?" Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." Victor frowned, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "How is that possible?" It was one night," Clara interrupted, her tears spilling over. "I didn't even know your real name. You never told me. And when you disappeared, I thought I'd never see you again." Victor's jaw tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't thought about that night in years, but now it came rushing back, the brief, fleeting connection they'd shared, and the way he'd walked away without a second thought. "I didn't know who you were," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "And when I found out I was pregnant, I had no way of finding you. I didn't want anything from you, Victor. I just wanted to give Jamie a good life." Victor exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what to say. The anger he'd felt earlier had melted into guilt, and he could see the pain in Clara's eyes, the weight of everything she'd been through. Before he could respond, the door to the study burst open, and Veronica stormed in. Her expression was a mixture of fury and triumph, as though she'd been waiting for this moment. "I knew it!" she hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "I knew there was something going on!" Clara froze, her tear-streaked face turning to Veronica in shock. "Mrs. Blackwell, don't you dare!" Veronica snapped, her voice rising. "Don't you dare play the victim here! This was your plan all along, wasn't it? To trap Victor? To weasel your way into his life? That's not true!" Clara protested, her voice shaking. "I didn't even know, spare me!" Veronica sneered. She turned to Victor, her eyes blazing. "And you? How could you let this happen? How could you be so careless?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Clara spoke first, her voice rising in desperation. "I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to do my job and take care of my son." Veronica's laugh was cold and cruel. "Your son," she repeated mockingly. "Of course. And now that Victor knows, you're hoping he'll swoop in and save the day, aren't you? Well, let me tell you something, Clara. You'll get nothing from us. Nothing. Clara's face burned with humiliation, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. She couldn't take this anymore. She wouldn't. I quit, she said suddenly, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. Victor's eyes widened. Clara, no, she said, cutting him off. I can't do this. I can't stay here and be treated like this. Jamie and I will be fine on our own. She turned on her heel, her heart pounding as she left the study. Jamie was playing in the kitchen when she found him, and she scooped him up without a word, ignoring the confused looks from the staff as she headed for the door. Mommy, what's wrong? Jamie asked, his small hands clutching her shoulder. Clara forced a smile, her voice trembling. Nothing, sweetheart. We're going home. Victor watched them leave from the study window, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He didn't stop her, didn't call out, but as the door closed behind them, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The sound of the door closing echoed through the vast halls of the Blackwell mansion, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Victor stood in the study, his mind spinning. He replayed Clara's tearful confession and Veronica's venomous accusations over and over. For the first time in years, he didn't have a clear course of action. His carefully constructed life had been upended by a boy in a superhero cape. Jamie wasn't just a random child. He was his child. Victor sank into his leather chair, staring at the desk in front of him but seeing nothing. Jamie's smile flashed in his mind, the way he'd called him, Daddy, without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And then there was Clara, standing there with tears in her eyes, defending herself against accusations she didn't deserve. He didn't know what to feel. Guilt? Anger? Sadness? It all swirled inside him, making him feel more unmoored than he ever had in his life. He thought about Veronica, her sharp words still ringing in his ears. She was his wife, and loyalty to her had always been a given. But now, how could he reconcile that loyalty with his responsibility to Jamie and to Clara? The desk in front of him caught his attention, cluttered with papers and folders. Among them was a small piece of paper that hadn't been there before. He reached for it, frowning as he unfolded the page. It was covered in colorful crayon scribbles, a child's handwriting scrawled across the top, Jamie's superhero mission list. Victor's brow furrowed as he scanned the list. The first item was written in bright red crayon and underlined 3 times. 1. Find my daddy. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His hand tightened around the paper as he stared at them, his chest aching. Jamie had been searching for him. He didn't know how or why, but the evidence was right there in front of him, written in the earnest, unsteady handwriting of a little boy. He read further down the list, his lips twitching despite himself when he saw the second goal. 2. Convince Mommy to buy me a dragon. Victor let out a quiet, incredulous laugh. The sheer innocence of it was enough to break through the heaviness weighing on him, if only for a moment. He could almost hear Jamie's voice in his head, full of excitement and determination. The list wasn't long, just a handful of goals, but it painted a picture of Jamie's world. It was a world full of wonder and imagination, but also one where he was searching for something bigger than himself. And now Victor knew what that something was. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know how it had ended up on his desk. Maybe Jamie had left it behind, or maybe one of the staff had found it, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what he was going to do about it. Victor spent the rest of the evening pacing the mansion, his thoughts a tangled mess. He avoided Veronica, who had locked herself in their bedroom after Clara left. She'd made her stance clear, and he wasn't in the mood for another argument. Instead, he wandered aimlessly, finding himself drawn to the places Jamie had been, the kitchen, the dining room, the hall where he'd first called him Daddy. Everywhere he went, he saw traces of the boy. A crayon left on the kitchen counter. A sticky fingerprint on the piano. A faint trail of whipped cream that no one had cleaned up yet. Victor found himself smiling at the memory, even as the ache in his chest deepened. He didn't know what kind of father he could be, what kind of father Jamie needed him to be, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't let Jamie's mission end in failure. The next day, Victor called his assistant and cleared his schedule. "Family emergency," he said curtly when she asked for details. He ignored her surprised tone and ended the call before she could press further. For the first time in years, work wasn't his priority. Instead, he drove to the address Clara had listed on her employment paperwork. It wasn't far, but the drive felt like an eternity as he rehearsed what he might say. Would Clara even open the door? Would she let him see Jamie? He didn't know, but he had to try. When he arrived, the sight of the small, weathered apartment building made his chest tighten. It was a far cry from the sprawling mansion he called home, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt as he imagined Clara raising Jamie here, struggling to make ends meet. He parked the car and walked up to the door, his heart pounding. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals and faced down boardrooms full of skeptics, he had never felt so nervous. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated, and then knocked twice. The door opened a crack, and Clara's face appeared. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she quickly stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and wary. "I need to talk to you," Victor said. "Please." Clara hesitated, glancing back at the door before nodding. She led him to a small bench outside the building, sitting down with her arms crossed. "What do you want, Victor?" she asked, her tone guarded. Victor took a deep breath, his hands resting on his knees. "I want to do the right thing," he said. "I know I've made mistakes, huge mistakes, but Jamie is my son. I can't pretend he doesn't exist." Clara's eyes softened, but her expression remained cautious. "What does that mean? Do you think you can just walk into his life and fix everything?" "I don't know," Victor admitted. "But I want to try. I want to be there for him, for both of you. Whatever that looks like." Clara studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face for sincerity. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't know what this is going to look like either," she said. "But Jamie deserves to know his father. And maybe we can figure it out together." Victor nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said quietly. Before Clara could respond, the door behind them opened, and Jamie peeked out, his superhero cape fluttering in the breeze. "Mommy? Who's that?" Clara smiled softly, holding out her hand to Jamie. "Come here, sweetheart." Jamie trotted over, his curious eyes darting between Clara and Victor. Victor crouched down to his level, his heart swelling as Jamie gave him a hesitant smile. "Hi, Jamie," Victor said, his voice gentle. "It's good to see you again." Jamie tilted his head, studying him. Then, with the same confidence that had thrown Victor's world into chaos days ago, he said, "Do you want to help me find a dragon?" Victor laughed, his first real laugh in days. "I think we can work on that," he said, reaching out to ruffle Jamie's hair. And for the first time, Victor felt like he might actually belong in Jamie's world. The following weeks passed in a blur for Clara. Despite her initial agreement to let Victor be part of Jamie's life, she kept her guard up. She didn't fully trust him, not yet. Victor had visited Jamie a handful of times, each interaction awkward at first but warming as Jamie's natural charm broke through Victor's composed demeanor. Jamie adored him, of course. "Daddy" was now part of his vocabulary, and the joy in his voice whenever Victor came around tugged at Clara's heart, even as she wrestled with her own doubts. Still, the weight of her decision to quit her job pressed down on her. Without the steady income, she struggled to make ends meet. Their tiny apartment, already in need of repairs, seemed to close in around her as the bills piled up. She was doing her best to shield Jamie from the stress, but he was perceptive, asking questions she couldn't easily answer. "Why are we packing, Mommy?" he asked one evening as Clara folded their clothes into boxes. She sighed, pausing to kneel in front of him. Because we might have to move soon, she said gently. But don't worry, sweetheart. I'll make sure we're okay. Jamie frowned, his little face scrunching with concern. I don't want to leave my superhero stuff. Clara forced a smile. We'll take all your superhero stuff with us. I promise. That night, after Jamie had fallen asleep, Clara sat alone in the living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes. She stared at the peeling wallpaper and the worn carpet, her mind racing with worry. What was she going to do? She'd worked so hard to give Jamie a stable life, but now it felt like everything was slipping away. A knock at the door startled her. Frowning, she stood and made her way over, unsure of who would visit so late. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Victor stood on the doorstep, his hands in his pockets, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. He was dressed casually, no suit, no tie, and the softness in his expression was far removed from the powerful CEO she'd worked for. Victor? She said, her voice tinged with surprise. What are you doing here? I needed to see you, he said simply. Can I come in? Clara hesitated, glancing back at the mess of boxes and the faint sound of Jamie's breathing from the bedroom. She sighed and stepped aside. Sure. Victor entered, taking in the cramped living room with a quiet glance. Clara folded her arms, suddenly self-conscious. It's not much, but it's home, she said defensively. It's not about that, Victor said, turning to face her. I came here to apologize, Clara. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. Apologize? Yes, he said firmly. For everything. For not recognizing you that first day. For walking away all those years ago. For leaving you to raise Jamie on your own. Clara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. You didn't know, she said quietly. I didn't, but that doesn't excuse it, Victor replied. And I want to make things right. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be here for Jamie, and for you. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She searched his face, looking for any hint of insincerity, but all she saw was a man genuinely trying to make amends. Still, the wounds of the past weren't so easily healed. You're asking me to trust you, she said slowly. And that's not something I can do overnight. I understand, Victor said, his voice steady. But I'm willing to earn it. I want to support you and Jamie, however I can. Not just financially, but as a father. Clara's walls began to crack, but before she could respond, Victor added, and there's something else. I've realized that my marriage to Veronica has been toxic for a long time. I've been holding on to it out of obligation, but it's not a real marriage, not anymore. I've filed for divorce. Clara's eyes widened. You. What? Victor nodded, his jaw tightening. It's not because of Jamie or you. It's because I finally see how unhealthy it is for both of us. Veronica deserves the chance to move on, and so do I. As if summoned by her name, a car screeched to a halt outside, and moments later, the door burst open. Veronica stood in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. So this is where you've been sneaking off to? She spat, her eyes darting between Victor and Clara. Veronica, Victor said, his tone calm but firm. This isn't your concern anymore. Not my concern? Veronica screeched. You're divorcing me for this maid and her brat? Clara's cheeks flushed with anger and humiliation, but Victor stepped between them, his expression hardening. Enough, Veronica. This isn't about you. It's about my son. Veronica let out a bitter laugh, her eyes glinting with malice. Oh, I see. You think you're going to play house now? Pretend you're some doting father? You're delusional, Victor. Victor's voice remained steady. Believe what you want, but this is my decision. You can make it as messy as you like, but it won't change anything. Veronica's lips curled into a sneer. You'll regret this, she hissed before storming out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara exhaled shakily, her hands trembling. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now. Victor said gently. I just needed you to know where I stand. Clara studied him, her heart conflicted. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let him in, but the fear of being hurt again held her back. Finally, she sighed. This doesn't mean everything's fixed. I know, Victor said. But it's a start. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the night settling over them. Then, from the bedroom, Jamie's voice broke the tension. Mommy? Daddy? Victor turned, his expression softening as Jamie appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and clutching his superhero cape. Clara's heart swelled as Jamie ran to Victor, climbing into his lap without hesitation. Victor held him close, his eyes meeting Clara's over Jamie's head. In that moment, Clara felt the smallest flicker of hope, a tentative belief that maybe they could figure this out after all. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change for Clara and Jamie. True to his word, Victor stepped in, not with grand, sweeping gestures, but with quiet, thoughtful actions that spoke louder than anything else. He helped Clara find a new home, a modest yet beautiful house with a small garden that Jamie immediately declared was perfect for playing superheroes. It wasn't extravagant, but it was safe, warm, and more than Clara had ever thought she could give Jamie. Clara stood in the kitchen of the new house one afternoon, unpacking dishes while Jamie ran around the empty living room, his superhero cape flapping behind him. Victor arrived with a box of groceries, setting them down on the counter before glancing around at the half-unpacked chaos. You didn't have to do that, Clara said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I wanted to, Victor replied, his tone calm and steady. I'm not here to just throw money at you and disappear. I want to help Clara. I want to be part of Jamie's life, and yours. Clara paused, the weight of his words settling over her. She still felt a cautious hesitation, but it was hard to deny how genuine Victor had been. He wasn't trying to take over or make decisions for her. He was simply there, showing up day after day. From the living room, Jamie called out, Mommy! Daddy! Come look at my superhero base! Victor and Clara exchanged a smile, the tension between them softening as they walked into the living room. Jamie had transformed a pile of moving boxes into a fortress, complete with a control panel, made of colored paper and an old shoebox. This is where I fight the bad guys, Jamie explained, his voice full of authority. But I need a sidekick. Victor crouched down to Jamie's level, a small smile playing on his lips. A sidekick, huh? What does a sidekick do? Jamie's eyes lit up. You have to fight bad guys with me. But you need a cape. Victor nodded solemnly, as though Jamie had just entrusted him with the most important job in the world. Got it. Where do I get a cape? Jamie thought for a moment, then ran to his room, returning with a towel he'd hastily tied into a makeshift cape. He handed it to Victor, who draped it over his shoulders, the corners barely reaching past his broad frame. How do I look? Victor asked, standing up straight. Like a real sidekick, Jamie declared, clapping his hands. Okay, the bad guys are over there. He pointed dramatically to an empty corner of the room. Victor didn't hesitate. With exaggerated movements, he pretended to dodge imaginary lasers, throwing mock punches and ducking behind the couch. Jamie laughed so hard he fell over, holding his stomach as Victor saved the day. Clara leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace, a sense that things might actually be okay. Victor wasn't just Jamie's father. He was becoming someone Jamie could look up to, someone who would fight invisible bad guys and wear a towel cape just to make his son smile. Later that evening, as the house quieted and Jamie drifted off to sleep in his new room, Clara and Victor sat together in the living room. The boxes were still there, half-packed and chaotic, but neither of them seemed to mind. I've been thinking, Victor said, breaking the silence, about how I can fit into Jamie's life without disrupting everything. Clara tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? I don't want to force anything, he explained. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I want to take this slow, to earn your trust and Jamie's. I don't just want to be a figure in the background. Clara studied him, her heart softening. She could see how much he cared, how much he was trying, and it was hard to hold on to her reservations when he was so clearly willing to put in the effort. I think you're doing just fine, she said softly. Jamie adores you. And I'm starting to see why. Victor smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. That means a lot, Clara. Thank you. Their conversation was interrupted by Jamie sleepily shuffling into the room, clutching his cape. I had a dream, he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. Victor stood, lifting Jamie into his arms with ease. What was it about? Jamie yawned, his head resting on Victor's shoulder. We saved the world. You and me. Mommy, too. Victor's eyes met Clara's, and she felt a sudden, unexpected wave of emotion. Jamie had a way of cutting through everything with his innocent, straightforward view of the world. To him, they were a team. And maybe, just maybe, they could be. The next weekend, Victor suggested they spend the afternoon at the park. Clara hesitated at first, but Jamie's enthusiasm quickly won her over. The three of them walked hand in hand through the park, Jamie skipping between them and pointing out every squirrel, bird, and dog he saw. When they reached the playground, Jamie raced ahead, climbing to the top of the jungle gym and declaring himself king of the world. Victor and Clara sat on a nearby bench, watching him with matching smiles. You know, Victor said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. I never imagined my life turning out like this. Clara glanced at him, her expression curious. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Victor met her gaze, his smile soft. It's a good thing. A very good thing. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, the last of her walls crumbling. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she didn't have to do this alone anymore. Maybe, after everything, they really could be a team. As the sun began to set, Jamie ran back to them, his face flushed with excitement. He grabbed both of their hands, his small fingers gripping tightly. We're a team now, he proclaimed, his voice ringing with joy. Me, Mommy, and Daddy. Right? Clara and Victor exchanged a look, their smiles matching as they both nodded. That's right, Clara said, her voice soft but full of conviction. We're a team. Jamie beamed, swinging their hands back and forth as they walked toward the fading light. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. They weren't just a team, they were a family. And so, with every step they took together, Clara, Victor, and Jamie embraced the start of a new chapter, a life filled with second chances, laughter, and love. Though the journey hadn't been easy, it had brought them closer, proving that even the most unexpected paths could lead to something beautiful. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales that inspire and touch the heart. What would you do if life gave you an unexpected second chance? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.